Today, I'll be testing different kinds of ND filter strengths in an excessive number of scenarios to help you choose the right one. This will include different frame rates at 24, 60, and 120 frames per second, as well as common maximum apertures of lenses at f1.4, 2.8, and 4.0. I then test all these at different times of the day, including sunset, sunrise, midday, and in cloudy conditions. By the end of this guide, you will know exactly what ND filter strength you need to buy depending on when and how you are shooting. The first scenario is sunset. I shot this between 21 and 13 minutes before the sun went down at 8:55 p.m. Given the time constraint, I was only able to get 24 frames per second at a 1/50th shutter with ND filter stops between 2 and 5. This is how f1.4 looks with no ND filter at 2 stops, 3, 4, and 5. f2.8 no filter, 2 stops, 3, 4, and 5. f4 no filter, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So in this scenario, with the last bit of light quickly fading for the day, ND filter strengths between 2 and 5 stops is more than sufficient for each aperture. To more easily see which ND filter strengths are required for each aperture and frame rate, I created this table. As I mentioned, I was only able to record 24 FPS and a 1/50th of a shutter. But given that 1/125th of a shutter is 1 1/3 stops darker than 1/50th, and a 1/250 shutter is 1 stop darker than 1/125th, I was able to estimate the rough exposure values for the other frame rates. The exposure values in black are the ones I recorded, the ones in pink are the ones I calculated, the light red boxes are values that are greater than 2 stops overexposed, and the light blue boxes are less than 2 stops underexposed. Another note is I'm only showing you how my face looks exposed, but during these tests I also took exposure readings for the landscape, with me trying to have the bottom half of the circle be the ground and the top half be the sky. Overall, throughout these tests, the landscape readings would more often than not be between a third and a whole stop brighter than the exposure readings on my face. Next is another golden hour scenario, sunrise. I recorded 60 and 120 frames per second at the appropriate 180-degree shutter rule with 2 and 5 stop variable ND, as well as 24 FPS with the 6 to 9 VND. This is 1/125th of the shutter at f1.4 with no filter, 2 stops, 3, 4, and 5. f2.8 no filter, 2, 3, 4, and 5. f4 no filter, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Moving to 120 FPS with a 1/250th of a shutter, this is f1.4 at 2 stops, 3, 4, and 5. f2.8 at 2, 3, 4, and 5. f4 at 2, and 3 stops. Given that 3 was already minus 1.7, I didn't check stops 4 and 5 to try and conserve time and lighting conditions. Lastly, back to 24 FPS with a 1/50th shutter, but testing VND at 6 to 9 stops wide open at 1.4. But I just need to quickly point out a slight mistake. I accidentally knocked my ISO up to 125, which is a third stop brighter than 100. 100 ISO is what I use for every single other test, given that it's the lowest ISO most cameras can go down to. So for these next shots, they should look slightly darker, and the meter should be roughly a third stop darker. Here is f1.4 at 6 stops, 7, 8, and 9. Here is a summary for the findings in sunrise lighting conditions. I put an asterisk beside the 6 to 9 stops for 1/50th of a shutter at 1.4 to show that these values had been reduced by a third to compensate for me shooting at ISO 125 instead of 100. Looking at this table, you can once again get most bang for your buck by getting ND filters between 2 and 5 stops, with the exception of course of f1.4 and a 1/50th shutter. A 7-stop N128 filter would be the most optimal there. It's interesting to look at these exposure values compared to the first test just before sunset. You can see they are all 1 1/3 and 1 2/3 brighter than the sunset, even though they were all recorded within a very short period of time of the sun coming up or the sun going down. Really shows how many stops of light you are quickly gaining in the mornings and how much light you are quickly losing in the evening. Next shooting scenario is right in the middle of the day and will likely be roughly the same lighting conditions you'd get throughout the day 2 hours after sunrise and 2 hours before sunset, and I was able to record every frame rate and every aperture between 2 and 9 stops. Starting with 1/50th of a shutter at f1.4 with no filter, 2, 3, 4, and 5 all being greater than 2 stops overexposed, 6, 7, 8, and 9 were much better exposed. f2.8 no filter, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. f4 no filter, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. 1/125th of a shutter at f1.4 no filter, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. f2.8 no filter, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. f4 no filter, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. 1/250th of a shutter at f1.4 no filter, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. f2.8 no filter, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. f4 no filter, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Here again is the summary table for midday sun lighting. ND filters with 6 to 9 stops is best suited for all frame rates at f1.4. ND filter strengths for f2.8 really depends on what frame rate you plan on shooting in, and f4, ND filters 2 to 5 stops will work for all frame rates. The final lighting scenario is midday but under cloudy conditions. I didn't record every single frame rate, aperture, and ND filter combination, but instead just selected a wide variety and then compared it to sunny conditions to see how many stops of light we lost in cloudy conditions. Here is 1/50th of a shutter, f1.4 at 7 stops, f2.8 at 5, and f4 at 4 stops. Then 1/125th f1.4 at 6 stops, f2.8 at 4, and 1/250th f1.4 at 5 stops, and lastly f4 at 2 stops. You can see on average the exposure was roughly 2/3 of a stop darker when in cloudy conditions. My landscape readings were mostly unchanged with some 1/3 of a stop brighter and one 1/3 of a stop darker. This is because you can see there was bright blue sky in the background even when I was in the shade. So there you go. You should have a much better idea of what ND filter strength you need depending on what time you're shooting, the widest aperture your lens can go to, and the frame rate you are using. As you can see, there is a lot of variation. Even though a singular ND filter offers better performance overall, the versatility of just 2 variable ND filters really has you always covered. As always, I respond to every single comment, so feel free to bug me with any questions you may have down below. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.